Okay, everybody, we're gonna move on to the next presentation. And Jennifer Watts from the Brookfield Zoo was kind enough to come by. And she's got a PhD in nutrition. So, hey, thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate you guys coming out and having me here. Unfortunately, my presentation is fairly short just because actually giving you nutritional requirements and recommendations is very difficult. So I can't give you absolute numbers of what you should be feeding your animals and what percentages of things. So we're just kind of going to go on an overview of different nutrients and kind of give you guys some information and hopefully help you with providing the best needs for your animals. So just the basics of nutrition. Everybody needs the same thing. So we're still talking about the same protein, fat, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals that we need as humans or any other animal needs. So I'm going to start with protein. And protein's really important for growth, for feathers, for all metabolism and cell processes. It's the communication lines of cells and things like that. So it's absolutely essential. But the thing is that it's made up of amino acids, and it's actually those amino acids that's more important than the total protein concentration that you have in your diet. So you could have enough protein in your diet, but if your amino acid balance is off, your animals are not going to thrive. So we need to make sure that we've got those concentrations and ratios in the right proportion. One of the things that's different with birds is that they require the amino acids that contain sulfur for producing feathers. That's an additional essential amino acid that birds need that humans and other mammals do not. So there are about 20 to 21, there's arguments about that last one, amino acids, of which 9 are essential. So that means that we cannot produce them ourselves. So we have to get them in the diet. Seeds contain a fair amount of protein, but most of the time their amino acid balance is not correct. So, and that's especially true with the commercialized and domestic seeds that we have in our mixes. That's going to be a theme throughout this entire presentation, is the difference between natural, wild, and cultivated. There's huge differences. And fruit is very low in protein, so it's not a good source of protein for our frugivorous animals. So we have to usually supplement those guys with other items. So I have a little chart here to kind of show you, this is the percent of amino acids in the diet. This showing the different essential amino acids. The horizontal lines on the bars show what the recommendations are. This is probably for chickens or quail or something like that. But I wanted to show that figs, the little white bar you can see here, doesn't even come close to providing the appropriate amount of amino acids. The ones that do are soybean and armyworms. Soybean is a really good source of protein. That's why you find it in most commercial diets, because it offsets usually the corn. That's also part of the diet. It's a very good source of protein. And then armyworms, being an insect, is actually very good in protein as well. And most insects, especially in the worm or pupa phase, are a good source of fat and protein compared to an adult beetle or cricket or things like that. But also just back, forward. Also, I just wanted to show that things that are normally in commercial diets like corn and millet do not meet, as I said, the nutritional requirements for the essential amino acids. Now, fat is something that we need to talk about because it is essential, but it's not something that we usually consider in terms of recommendations. It is important for, of course, metabolism and energetics, and also for cell membranes. It's essential. Cell membranes are made up of lipids. But similarly to proteins, fats are made up of fatty acids. And it's actually those fatty acids that are more important than the total amount of fat. So it's the same idea as behind with protein. We also include the carotenoids in this group. They are a lipid-based compound, so the carotenes and the xanthophylls that our birds need for plumage and coloration are really important. Although you can't specifically say, I want this compound for my bird to turn this color, because every species utilizes those carotenoids in different ways and produces their own compound. So flamingos versus carmine bee eaters versus zebra finches all use different compounds. Although you could feed them the same thing, they could also synthesize it and turn it into whatever they need. So you can't just feed one type of carotenoid and make sure that that's going to work for all the species. So as I said, there's no absolute requirement for fat, but it's those fatty acids. The essential fatty acids are the linoleic and linolenic acids. Those are the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And there has to be an absolute ratio between those two for the body processes to activate correctly. So it's actually that ratio that's more nutritionally relevant than the actual amounts. So you need to make sure when you, some commercial diets will state that linoleic and linolenic, otherwise you usually have to get it tested to get that information. Moving on to carbohydrates, we all know that glucose is the essential energy source. That's what everything gets broken down to, is to glucose. It is the energy currency of all life, mostly. But there are two major types of carbohydrates that provide that glucose. There are simple carbohydrates and there's complex. We've all heard about them when talking about human nutrition, the difference between those two. So I have this little chart here to kind of show how it gets broken down. So we have monosaccharides, which is just one sugar molecule, and that's where glucose comes in. We also have fructose and galactose. Disaccharides, obviously, are two molecules. That's where you can see sucrose, our table sugar, is actually two molecules. It's actually glucose and fructose bonded together. But the really interesting ones are the polysaccharides. So these are hundreds of sugar compounds attached together. And the really interesting thing is that starch and cellulose are actually both made up of just glucose. And the only difference is the way that they're bonded. And that bonding makes that complete difference between starch, which we can digest very easily and break it down into glucose, versus cellulose, which is what makes up plant walls and indigestible fiber, which we can't break down. So in order for our animals to be able to break down cellulose, they have to have a relationship with bacteria. There is no vertebrate animal that has the enzyme to break down cellulose. It only comes from bacteria. So that's why we have animals like ruminants that use bacteria to break down the fiber, the grasses that they eat. Ostriches have ceca, which is what our appendix is. They have a very well-developed ceca because they eat mostly grasses, and so they have to have those bacteria pockets to be able to hold the grass and give the bacteria time to break down the cellulose. So fruit and nectar contain mostly the simple carbohydrates. That's why those animals that usually consume those kinds of foods need to eat very frequently, because it gets used up and digested very quickly. So that's one of the things we have to keep in mind for our fruit and nectar consumers. On the other hand, insects and veggies and grasses contain mostly the complex carbohydrates. So those usually have a little bit more of a digestion time, a little bit more need for that to be able to break down, and they're able to then, kind of like the glycemic index that people talk about, it releases the sugar over a longer period of time to help keep blood sugars a little bit more steady. So vitamins and minerals are present in very low amounts, but that does not in any way indicate that they are not as important. So they're just recommended in parts per million because they're just needed in much lower amounts. But they're very essential in terms of what they're needed for. So vitamin D, we know mostly is for bone metabolism. Vitamin E is an antioxidant necessary for protective against oxidative stress and cell membrane function. Of course, calcium for bone function, bone metabolism as well. And iron is absolutely necessary as well, although we do have the issues with iron storage. So there is, as you asked about, toxicity, we can have too much of a good thing in that respect. So just briefly talking about the natural diet, finches consume mostly seeds, but it does change based on season. They may focus on the perennial grasses in the fall and the annuals in the spring. But they eat such a variety of them that although the seeds may not be in and of themselves nutritionally balanced, because they eat such a variety of them, they can usually come up with a balanced diet based off of that. And again, to hit that point that the wild grass seeds are not the same as what our cultivated seeds are. We've we've genetically modified the seeds to meet what we want them to be. And that's similarly with fruit as well, which I'll talk about in a second. They do consume insects for the protein, to be able to get that protein, especially during chick rearing and things like that. They use that, and then other types of plant matter as well. For our frugivorous birds, I'm really going to touch on that wild versus cultivated. So I love doing this picture. I'm a bit messed up. This is an example of a fairly wild fig. So you can see the cuticle is very thick. It's very dry looking, not very appetizing, and it's got a very small amount of pulp in that. And you compare that to what we have as a domesticated fig, and there is a huge difference. We've genetically changed most fruits to be more sugary, more sweet, less fibrous, and more moist. All of those things are completely opposite as to what these animals have evolved to be able to digest. That means we're giving them more simple sugars, which is not good for their blood sugar. It gets changed into fat more quickly. They don't have the time that higher amount of fiber to digest and slowly release the glucose. And then the water just waters down all the nutrients so that they're not getting as much nutrition per bite as they would with a wild fig. What is going on there? Well, that wasn't supposed to do that, but anyway. So actually, one of the things that we do, and especially at the zoo, is we feed more vegetable matter than we do fruits, because vegetables are actually more nutritionally close to the wild fruits than our domestic fruits.
Wow.
So it's actually better to feed, and I say, you can use fruits as a treat or as a training tool or things like that, but the base part of the diet that you use as produce should be vegetables. Just because it's more nutritionally appropriate. And then greens, although our greens again have been domesticated to be a lot more moist and a lot less nutritionally complete than wild plant matter, they are important because they do contain the most amount of fiber per bite than any other kind of vegetable. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, the protein requirement is much lower for these birds. So that's something you have to take into account when looking at your diet as to whether or not these birds don't need 15% protein in their diet. They can survive on 6. So that's something that we need to keep into consideration. For insectivorous birds, most of them consume the larvae or sometimes the adult insects, but those are very different things. Pupa and larva are very high in fat to be able to get the insect through its molting and conversion to being an adult insect. The adult insects are usually the ones that are very low in energy and high in protein. So especially when you're dealing with strictly insectivorous animals, it's really important. They're used to surviving on a very low energy diet, something that they eat a lot of insects because the insect in and of itself is not very calorically dense. So they need to be able to eat a lot of them to get the total amount of energy that they need for the day.
The Atkins diet.
Yes, the Atkins diet. The problem is, especially with adult insects, is that they have that exoskeleton that is really hard to digest. So most birds do have the enzyme to break that down if they're an insectivorous bird. So the chitin that's in an exoskeleton is broken down by chitinase in the gut. And you have to remember, too, that an exoskeleton is not like a regular skeleton. It doesn't have calcium or phosphorus or anything else in it. So we really have to be careful with, especially if the majority of your diet is insects, that your insects have been either gut-loaded or dusted with calcium to be able to support the nutrition of the predator. So,
Egg production.
And egg production, yes, especially during that time, yeah. And then commercial insects, again, what we have available to us commercially is not the same as what they would see in the wild. There are no commercial beetle producers, because that would be the best thing to get for all of our animals is some kind of beetle or dragonflies or something that's more adult than the mealworms, waxworms, fly larvae, all of those soft body worms. That's what's available to us. And those are, especially since they're commercially produced, they're bred to grow fast and fat and moist, which is not the same. It's similar to fruit. It's not the same that they've been evolved to digest.
So dust, calcium.
Actually, it's often better to, instead of dusting, depends also how quickly your bird eats the insects, because dusting, especially with crickets, they'll clean themselves off if they're not eaten quickly. And worms, if they burrow, will do the same thing. The dust will just kind of get worn off. So it's actually better to ensure that your bird is going to get the proper nutrition, is to gut load the insects. So what that means is you take the insect and you feed it a diet that's very high in calcium. And so they have to be on that diet for about 2 days. And then their gut is full of all of that diet that's high in calcium. So that way when you feed it to your bird, it gets that internal calcium as part of their diet too. We do that all the time at the zoo because that's the best way to be able to ensure that our birds and herps and amphibians get enough calcium.
In other words, you are what you eat.
Exactly. Yes. Predators, exactly. They are what they eat.
Do you use a special gut load diet or?
There are several on the market. Missouri
Yeah.
makes an insect gut diet. Marion makes an ortho-cal insect meal. I'm sure those are the two main ones I know because those are the ones that we use, but I'm sure something like Ziegler or Zupreme, also everybody knows this, that it needs to get done, so it's something that's out there commercially to be available for you. So starting with recommendations is that I do recommend the commercial diet be part of your total diet, just because it does provide those essential trace nutrients that aren't in insects or fruit, because insects and fruit and seeds in and of themselves are not nutritionally complete. And zinc or manganese or cobalt, those really small nutrients that you don't need a lot of, aren't present in a high enough concentration in any of those feeds to be able to make sure that you're giving your animal the appropriate amount. So especially for amino acids and for those small, really trace nutrients, it's important to have know that your animal is consuming some commercial diet to make sure that they're meeting those recommendations.
So by commercial diet, do you mean pellets?
Pellets, yes. Again, if you use seeds, just understand that they're not the same as the wild seeds. I know the birds love them. They will preferentially choose them, but to use it in moderation as equal with the commercial diet. The one thing with commercial diets is there's a lot of variability in ingredients. So you have to be very attuned to that and keep an eye on what those ingredients are and what the proportion of them are. You really only need to worry about those first 4 or 5 ingredients because those are the ones that are the major parts of the ingredients. The rest of those are usually supplements as well, and then I mentioned that as well. So variability in supplementation. I know that you can look at the guaranteed analysis and that really only gives you usually protein, fiber, fat, moisture, calcium, phosphorus, and maybe vitamin A and D if you're lucky. If you're really serious about making sure that your diet is balanced, I do suggest that you get the diet analyzed, just because you can get the full mineral panel on that and the fat and fiber content of that as well. That only costs usually less than $50 to get that done. The vitamins are very expensive. So if that's something that you're concerned about, it could be worth it for you, then I recommend to do that if you think that there might be a problem. Otherwise, it's fairly balanced within the commercial diets that we don't have to worry about a toxicity. So the unfortunate thing, and like I said at the beginning of the presentation, it's very difficult to make recommendations for these kinds of birds because all the information that's out there is based on, number one, grain-eating and plant-eating species, most of which that are used in production situations. So we're talking turkeys and geese and ducks and quail, chickens. So it's very difficult, and we run into this in all kinds of species because the equations that are used to determine energy needs or vitamin A concentrations, or even especially calcium, is not the same as what we need for our birds. For example, for laying hens, they require 2.5% calcium in their diet because they lay every day. But that is completely not necessary for any of our birds that may lay, once a year. But if they do clutch several times, we do want to make sure that you are providing them with a supplemental calcium source so that they can ensure that you don't get shellless eggs or broken eggs as the clutches go through the year. Again, frugivorous and nectivorous species need less protein. So what about fiber and fat? Fiber is important for these birds to be able to keep the digestion going properly. So it's not necessarily that it's required for the birds, but we don't want to focus solely on simple carbohydrates. We want to have complex carbohydrates in the diet to help with having a healthy digestive tract. And fat is important. It's just, again, moderation. Keep an eye on that fat percentage in that commercial diet and make sure it shouldn't be over probably 15%. That's really high. So anything lower than that is usually is appropriate. And again, it's based on what your animal needs. You may need to use different diets at different times of the year based on what situation they're in, what the temperature is, how they're housed, those kinds of things. Calcium and phosphorus is really important, but also the ratio of those two. So you want to have a ratio of at least 2 to 1, 2 parts calcium, 1 part phosphorus. Insects, seeds, and fruit all have an inverse calcium phosphorus ratio. So they're more like 1 to 4 or 1 to 20. So again, those in and of themselves are completely inappropriate to be able to provide the appropriate amount of calcium.
So how do you at the zoo, how do you provide the calcium?
We usually use cuttlebone,
Okay.
or we'll use oyster shell grit for some animals, or especially with the insectivorous animals, we gut load.
Okay.
But also providing a pellet that we make sure that they eat.
Yeah.
So we have it stuck to the fruit. So as they're eating fruit, they're kind of
Okay.
on the side ingesting some pellets as well,
So
because they
more
provide.
oyster shell.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
And then vitamins A, D, and E, which, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, are the ones that you need to be concerned about because those are the ones that you could have a potential toxicity. Vitamin C and all of the B vitamins, they just get excreted out if there's too much of it, not needed. So you don't have to worry about those. These guys are important and can be seen as a deficiency in some situations, but you do have to worry about toxicity because it can build up and it sits in the fat and doesn't go anywhere. So it can build up to become toxic. So of course my take-home message is just variety. This picture has too much fruit in it for me, but it was the best picture I could find that showed a nice bird variety diet type like that. So, and that's kind of common sense. For anybody who's serious about raising birds, you know that a variable diet is what's most important. So I know our bird curator came and talked to you guys 2 years ago and kind of talked about the project that we were doing at the zoo. So I kind of wanted to update you a little bit on what we were doing
Okay.
on our end with the passerines that we're having concerns with at the zoo. So we've had poor chick survivability in our tanagers, cardinals, and starlings. And we actually were able to notice that because our bird curator brought in, most zoos maybe only have 1 pair or 2 pairs of birds, and if they don't produce a chick, you kind of can put it off to bad parenting, or maybe something was going on in the environment. But when we're producing 70 chicks a year, because we have 10 pairs of tanagers and only 10 of them are surviving, then we know we have a problem, that there's a global problem going on, and it's not just bad parenting. There's something that we're doing wrong. So that was what we were seeing in these species of birds. We had enough of them that we were able to see over time that we were not being successful with our chicks. So we did look at environmental factors. So we looked at temperature, humidity, UV, all of those things. And the thing is that all of these different pairs of birds were in different buildings. So there wasn't any one thing that we could attest was the problem. Granted, all of the birds were indoors, and only some had access to skylights. But again, we had birds that didn't have UV, or that did have UV lights and didn't, and natural sun, and we were still seeing that problem amongst all of the species of birds. So one of the things I did was I focused on iron, because when I was looking at our diet, we originally used a softbill diet that was a low iron diet, as we know, because people use it because of the possibility of iron storage disease as the birds age. As I drilled down to kind of figure out how much the birds were consuming, it was very, very low. And I didn't think that it was actually enough to support putting enough iron into the yolk to be available for the chick. So we did the opposite of what everybody else was doing, and we actually went with a higher iron diet. We not only increased the iron in our diet, but we increased the vitamin C, which actually helps make the absorption of iron better. So, and we added different fruits in that had higher vitamin C levels. And in the initial problems that we were seeing were the chicks were dying at about 2 to 3 days of age. And we could tell, because we pulled some for hand rearing to see if we could make a difference, and to see whether or not we actually found that they were very ataxic and they had a very poor feeding response. So we knew it wasn't the parent's fault. There was something going on with the chick. When we increased the iron, our survivability actually increased. But unfortunately, the chicks were now dying between 6 and 10 days of age. But what we were seeing now was metabolic bone disease. So now we realized we had a vitamin D deficiency as well. So we had multiple things going on with that. So the first year we fixed the iron deficiency, but then we found we had a vitamin D deficiency. So we had first sprinkled a vitamin D supplement on our frugivore diet that we make. But when you think about it, it's such a small amount in such a large amount of food to be the appropriate concentration. And with these little birds, that if they just ate, if somebody ate one granule of it, a whole, that could be enough vitamin D for, 5 birds. So instead of supplementing with a powdered vitamin D, we realized that what we needed to do was to change our pellet. So we changed our pellet, and we went to our manufacturer and said, can you make an experimental diet for us that has more vitamin D, more iron, more vitamin C? So we did that. They've been on that diet now for a year, and we've seen some marginal success. We do think that there's maybe some other things going on, that they may not be consuming enough of the pellet. So we actually, last summer, I had an intern that did a consumption study and weighed in every item in and out that these birds consumed over several days. So I haven't gotten all that data compiled yet, so we haven't been able to see if they're really consuming as much pellet as we want them to. So we actually just had a meeting Tuesday and kind of really sat down and said, what do we need to do? So we're actually going to do another experiment where we're going to take 10 pairs of tanagers and 10 pairs of cardinals and kind of give them a diet that is just pellets, blueberries, and papaya. That's all they get. And mix it, and so that they really have no choice but to consume some pellet. The pellet will be offered ad libitum, so it'll always be available to them, and then we would just put the fresh blueberries and papayas in every morning. So we kind of give them that opportunity that, well, if you run out of blueberries, then the only choice you have is to eat some pellets. So we're hoping that maybe will show some better results.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
Because I've raised a lot of the tanagers and cardinals. And, well, first of all, there can't be many pairs together because they fight.
Yes, well, we do that, yes.
But secondly, as I learned years ago from a lady in Florida, she raised a lot of the Brazilian cardinals. And what she did was she took the Zucreme pellets, the breeder pellets, breeder fruit pellets, and she soaked them in a vitamin and calcium liquid.
Oh, okay.
And so daily, they always have the dry pellets available, but daily she would give them the soaked pellets.
Oh, okay.
And they do consume those almost more than the dry pellets.
We actually soaked, in order to try to increase pellet consumption, we actually soaked our pellets in blueberry juice, and it did work.
Oh,
We
did it?
actually were able to convert a lot of birds over to almost half of their diet being pellets just by soaking them in blueberry juice, because I think visually it helped, and just the taste, because they really love blueberries.
Yeah, they
I
do
mean,
love blueberries.
Everybody loves blueberries.
Yeah.
So
But try a vitamin, and then I put, I forget which vitamin, and an indoor vitamin, which is high in the stuff.
Mhm.
And then in water with calcium.
Okay,
So then you soak the pellets in that.
right. Okay,
And
that's a
you
good
brush
idea.
every day.
yeah. Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually, hello, there. So I'll leave that with any other questions that you might have. Yeah.
When you soak it in blueberry
Mhm.
juice, doesn't it dissolve?
No, they don't. The pellets will often maintain, they're pretty good at maintaining their integrity, especially bird pellets, because we know that they pick them up and will mash them,
It's
and
supposed to
but it needs to be intact for them, so they actually have a pretty good integrity for that.
Yeah.
We were talking Pearl Morbid, that's coming out now. It's supposed to replace the,
Some of the greens. It's
Some
a
of the
dried,
greens.
pelleted replacement supposedly for greens.
Oh, okay.
And you can either soak them
which
or
I do.
or even
Dry.
like
Dry.
pellets dry.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
they pick through them. But I don't know if that's helped with my softballs.
I don't know if it's helped them either.
But I do know the
I'm
soaking.
hoping you guys had already done
The
the
soaking
research.
of the pellets works for across the board the softbills and the fruit dumps.
Okay. Okay. The problem is that we have so few, besides the cardinals and the tanagers, we have so few of so many species
Yeah.
that we can't do a lot of experimentation on them
Yeah.
to actually have a statistical proof that something worked. I mean, it's the same thing with rhinos. I mean, we've only got 3
Oh.
rhinos.
Yeah.
We can't do an experiment on them because an N of 3.
Yeah.
doesn't
that's
really
one
do
that
anything.
died out of San Diego.
Oh, the northern, yeah.
He was
Do you have a preference on a brand of pellets?
I do not. I mean, because it all depends on your situation,
Yeah.
whether your animals are outside, have access to dirt. Because that's important. I honestly think that for some of our animals, the reason why we see some nutritional deficiencies is because our facilities are so clean. They don't have that kind of
They
contamination.
love dirt.
They
Oh, I know. I'm
do.
sure they do.
Same with their